This man is one of the most brutal killers and sadists in history. Josef Mengele, known as the Angels of Death, cut out organs without anesthesia, carried out amputations, tortured adults and children with cold, heat and radiation. The monster killed tens of thousands of people in Nazi Auschwitz, but was never brought to justice for the rest of his life. But why did Mengele escape punishment? Why did he conduct his terrible experiments on people, and was there at least some practical meaning in them? On February 7, 1979, an elderly man drowned on the Brazilian beach of Zayatugu. He was identified as 54-year-old Wolfgang Gerhard, an Austrian citizen. An autopsy showed that he died of a stroke. The Austrian was buried, and the story could have ended there if not for the German police, who suspected that the drowned man was not at all who he seemed to be. The reason was an intercepted letter from Brazil to Josef Mengele's former employer. Brazilian law enforcement officers took advantage of the tip and checked the address from where the letter was sent. It was then that the truth was revealed. Under the name of Wolfgang Gerhard, that same angel of death lived there for many years. An autopsy of the grave and a DNA test finally proved it was really him. Mengele's son, shortly after his death, said in an interview that his father did not repent of what he had done until the end of his days. He didn't think he did anything wrong. He told me he was only following orders. This statement outraged the victims of the inhuman doctor. The victims believed that Mengele carried out the experiments at his own request. And they brought him pleasure. Science of extermination. Mengele's name is closely associated with eugenics. This doctrine appeared in Britain. The term was coined by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in the second half of the 19th century. He tried to find out how to combat the degeneration of humanity, and for this he studied hereditary characteristics. For example, Galton was able to prove that outstanding parents are more likely to have outstanding children. The idea of ridding society of defects and hereditary diseases looked very attractive. Gradually, eugenics began to be taught in universities, and so it became part of the state policy of many countries. But soon the theory came to the conclusion that in order to speed up the emergence of ideal people, it is necessary to remove harmful genes. So in 1886, the United States passed a law prohibiting marriages and cohabitation with epileptics, the mentally ill and the insane. Violation of the law was punishable by prison, but this did not stop anyone. Then the authorities decided to move to more stringent measures, forced sterilization of people with various disabilities and diseases. Now doctors could decide for themselves whether the children from this person would benefit the state or not. In total, about 60,000 people were sterilized in the United States in those years. It looks like programs were in place in Canada, France, Japan, Iceland, Sweden, and other countries. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, they immediately put eugenics into the service of ideas about racial hygiene. In addition to forced sterilization, which forced hundreds of thousands of people from 1934 to 1945, the Nazis moved directly to mass murder. Children with incurable diseases, including mental ones, were the first to be included in the program in 1939. Later, in addition to children, they will begin to destroy adults. Until 1941, as a result of such purges, about 70,000 people died. At the same time, Josef Mengele, inspired by the ideas of Hitler, studied medicine, wanting to apply it for the benefit of the Reich. From a military doctor to the angel of death. Joseph was born in 1911 into the family of a large entrepreneur, but did not want to follow in the footsteps of his father, who founded an agricultural business. Mengele received a medical education and got a job at the Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene. He soon became an assistant to physician Othmar von Verschuer, who specialized in twins, genetic abnormalities, and hereditary diseases. It was then that Mengele awakened to a terrible scientific interest in people with special needs. In 1940, Mengele went to war, where he served as a doctor until 1942. Then he was wounded and declared unfit for service. During this time, his former mentor Virchow became the head of the Institute of Anthropology, Eugenics and Heredity, and it was he who invited Josef to work in a concentration camp for the benefit of German science. Reich scientists were faced with the task of creating faster, cheaper methods of sterilization and killing. In addition, they needed new medicines and ways to treat wounded German soldiers. Mengele was appointed chief physician in one of the Auschwitz units, but Josef did not treat patients there at all. Mengele personally examined the remaining prisoners and decided who would remain alive to work, who would be sent to the gas chamber, and who would be taken with him for experiments. And although the experimental subjects received special treatment, they received improved nutrition and were freed from hard work. What these people experienced during Mengele's experiments was worse than death. Monstrous experiments. Almost no one returned from Mengele's laboratory alive. All medical manipulations and experiments took place without anesthesia. No one cared about the further fate of the subjects either, because they were considered consumables. There is a known case when Mengele cut out a kidney alive from one of his victims and sent him to work immediately after the operation. Dr. Death conducted many terrible experiments in the bacteriological department. This is what one of the participants in these terrible experiments says. So we gathered 154 people, I think, and sent 25 barracks to this. Then this Mengele came, their whole retinue was probably about 7 people. First they bathed us, first we had to dive into the brown solution, just take care of our eyes. And then in the milk solution, with the brown one, you come out as if smeared with vegetable oil, so elastic. But the milky milk just eats up the wounds and there's just blue smoke coming out of the wound, but the pain is unbearable. Belarusian Zina Dolishakova ended up in Auschwitz when she was 20 years old. She managed to survive terrible torture, and even became Mengele's favorite thanks to her amazingly resilient body. She spent 2 years in a concentration camp, 3 months of which she was an experimental subject. Another significant part of Mengele's work was experiments in sterilizing people. The doctor was trying to figure out how to increase the birth rate of the Aryans and at the same time destroy all those undesirable. He once sterilized a group of Polish nuns using X-rays. After the terrible experiences, almost all prisoners died from sepsis, blood poisoning or shock. But most of all, Mengele wanted to understand the reasons for the appearance of people with genetic abnormalities, which is why he was interested in experimental subjects with special features, such as dwarfs and twins. We were holding Mom when a Nazi ran up to us and screamed, "Gemini the twins!" He noticed us because we were dressed the same and looked very similar. He asked if my mom had twins. Mom didn't know what to answer. She asked, "Is this good?" The Nazi answered yes. My mother said yes, and at that moment another Nazi came up. He pulled my sister and me to one side and pushed my mother to the other. We cried, she cried. Eva and her family ended up in Auschwitz in 1944. She and her twin sister Miriam were then 10 years old. Upon arrival, they were immediately taken to Dr. Mengele's laboratory, while the father's mother and 2 other sisters were sent to the gas chamber. By studying twins, Mengele tried to find out whether it was possible to get a guaranteed birth of twins or triplets from a German woman. During the experiments, about 3,000 twins went through the hands of a half-arm with scalpels. Only 300 managed to survive. On Tuesdays and Saturdays they sent us to another laboratory, which I called the blood laboratory, where they bandaged my arms to stop the blood flow, took blood from my left arm and gave at least 5 injections into my right arm. I didn't know what exactly they were injecting me with, not then, not now. After one of these injections, Eva developed a high fever. It turned out that Dr. Death infected her with tuberculosis to see how she would cope with the disease. This was part of another monstrous experiment that hundreds of twins were subjected to. If one of the twins died, then the Nazi killed the second one and opened it up to compare the affected organs. The twins also received blood transfusions and organ transplants, both from each other and from other children, to see if they would survive. Eva and her sister Miriam miraculously survived the lethal injection, but Miriam began to have kidney problems. When, already as an adult, she went for an examination, the doctors were horrified that after unknown injections her kidneys stopped developing, they remained like those of a 10-year-old child. In addition to the response to fatal diseases, Mengele studied the genetic differences between twins. To do this, for example, he amputated individual organs of experimental subjects. One of the most terrible stories happened when Dr. Death noticed two brothers, one of whom sang wonderfully, and the other had no voice. Mengele cut out the vocal cords of both, only to study them in detail and understand the difference. The special objects of research for the doctor were Siamese twins, and although doctors had long been looking for ways to separate children fused in the womb from each other, Mengele, on the contrary, stitched together healthy twins to see what would come of it. So he walked between the gypsy twins, enduring inhuman torment. After a few days, the children died from blood poisoning. Was Mengele also interested in physiological abnormalities? In 1944, a Jewish family of musicians from Romania was brought to Auschwitz. Some of the family members were of normal height, some were midgets. Mengele liked them so much that they were provided with separate housing and good food. In search of the reasons for the deviation, blood was taken from the Lilliputians, bone marrow was extracted, teeth and hair were pulled out, they were irradiated, infected with bacteria, and blinded with special drops. But despite these tortures, the Lilliputian family became the only one that managed to survive in its entirety. Escape to Mengele. Mengele had incredible luck, because he was able to escape from Auschwitz just 10 days before the liberation of the concentration camp by Soviet troops. True, he was soon detained near Nuremberg, but even then luck smiled on him. The doctors released him and were unable to establish his identity. For 4 years, Mengele hid in Bavaria, working in a potato factory, and then, using rat trails, a system of escape routes for Nazis and fascists from Europe, he sailed to Argentina with an Italian passport. In those years, they didn't even look for Mengele. There were rumors that he had died, and his crime would become known only in the 1950s. At the same time, the first warrant for the arrest of the Angel of Death will be issued, but by that time traces of the monster had long been lost. In Argentina, he worked as a doctor, specializing in abortions, but was put on trial due to the death of one of his patients. True, he managed to get out of this too, and he immediately moved to Paraguay. At that time it was an ideal place for Nazi criminals. The local dictator Alfredo Stroessner had no problem giving Ukhrudiev to everyone who was being hunted in Europe, and in gratitude these people advised his army and intelligence services. At that time, suspicions had already arisen in Europe that Mengele might be alive. A hunt was opened for him. Israeli authorities picked up his trail in Argentina in 1959, but it was too late. Fearing persecution, he decided to change his place of residence again, and secretly moved from Paraguay to Brazil, changing his name. There, with the support of the Austrian Wolfgang Gerhard, who sympathized with Nazism, Mengele was assigned to work for the Hungarian family. They didn't even suspect who they actually employed, and when the truth was revealed, Mengele paid them for their silence. For fear of exposure, he still had to flee to Sao Paulo. At that time a reward of almost $3.5 million was placed on his head. Mengele settled with the Austrian couple Lieslott and Wolf-Roma Bossert, by which time his Brazilian patron Wolfgang Egerhard had returned to his native Austria, and Josef decided to take his name. It seemed that he managed to get lost. The hunters seemed to have been thrown off the trail. Even Mengele's son Rolf managed to come to Brazil for 2 weeks. Josef lived peacefully until he suffered a stroke while swimming in the ocean on February 7, 1979. The Nazi criminal died at the age of 67, unrepentant and never answering for his atrocities. Now the remains of the Angel of Death, which are not even needed by the families, are located at the Institute of Forensic Medicine of Sao Paulo, and serve as a benefit for students. Josef Mengele was far from the only doctor of the Third Reich who conducted horrific experiments in concentration camps. In Buchenwald, for example, poisons were tested on prisoners and the course of the poisoning was monitored. In the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp, experimental subjects were infected with streptococcus or tetanus directly through open wounds. And then they checked the effectiveness of their healing with various drugs. In the same camp, bones, muscles and nerves were transplanted, all in order to more effectively treat wounded soldiers of the Third Reich. In Dachau they studied what happens to the body under the influence of low and high atmospheric pressure. The prisoners were placed in a pressure chamber, and the conditions experienced by the pilot were simulated when the cabin was depressurized at altitudes of up to 20,000 meters. Experiments with hypothermia were also conducted there. The victims were immersed in ice water, they were observed and effective methods of warming were selected. All this was intended to help the Reich soldiers endure the Russian frosts. All Nazi experiments are carefully documented. Much of today's emergency medicine is based on these horrifying records. For example, it was during the experiment at Dachau that doctors realized that hypothermia of the cerebellum leads to death. Thanks to this, life jackets have since then had a special headrest that holds the back of the head above the surface of the water. All modern passenger aircraft are equipped with such vests. Hundreds of victims who were forcibly brought to gangrene became the price for the discovery of a method of treating this tissue damage with the help of sulfonamides. These antibiotics are still used today. It is simply impossible to calculate the exact number of victims of Nazi research, because many documents about the experiments and those killed were destroyed either by the SS or by doctors personally, but the number is at least hundreds of thousands of lives. Many scientists do not see any sense in Mengele's own experiments. This man was most likely an extremely cruel madman. Science was just an excuse for him to satisfy sadistic tendencies, otherwise how else could one explain the injection of chemicals into the eyes, the amputation of limbs and the attempt to create Siamese twins? Did you know that we are still using the results of the horrific experiments of the Nazis? Write in the comments.